On Friday, Israel launched direct strikes on Iran. These strikes killed top officials and hit military bases and some nuclear-related sites. Post reporter Yeganeh Torbati has been covering Iran for years. So after these strikes, she immediately reached out to sources inside Iran to understand how people were feeling. She spoke to a man named Mehrdad. He lives in Bandar Abbas in southern Iran, and we're only using his first name to protect him from government reprisal. Mehrdad told her he was so tired of living under the Iranian government's repression and mismanagement that he initially welcomed these attacks.
واقعا من بیش از 10 ساله که انقدر عمیقاً خوشحال نشده بودم که امروز خوشحالم. یعنی از صبح که پا شدم این اخبار رو دیدم خیلی خیلی خوشحالم، خودم، خانواده‌ام.
So he's saying there that he has not been as deeply happy as he is now in more than 10 years. When he woke up and saw the news, he, felt joy, and so did his family.
و هیچ هراسی نداریم و میدونیم حتی اگر جنگ کلانی بشه که مردم هم گرفتارش بشن ولی باز هم از این وضعیتی که الان توش توسط این حکومت هستیم بهتر هست.
And he's saying there that we don't have any fear, and we know that even if we get pulled into a big war that implicates the people, it would still be better than the situation that we have now with this government.
Given the Iranian government's repression, it can be difficult to gauge public opinion inside Iran. Reporting and conducting good opinion polls there is very difficult. But Yeganeh said she initially heard from a lot of Iranians who echoed Mehrdad, that they weren't too worried. But then, by the fourth day of growing Israeli strikes and Iranian counterstrikes, Mehrdad's tone changed.
ما حقیقتش نگرانیم که این جنگ طولانی تر بشه و نگران هموطنامون هستیم.
So he says there that we are worried that this war is going to go on for a long time, and we're worried for our fellow citizens.
و نگرانی اصلی خودم اینه که خدایی نکرده بعد این جنگ باز همین رژیم و همین حکومت سر کار باشه.
And he's saying there that my own worry is that, God forbid, after this war, this same regime or government is still in place.
و حالا با این وضعیت ما خودمون همینجوری 50 سال از دنیا عقب افتادیم. الان که زیر ساخته هم دارن نابود میشن، دوباره این رژیم سر کار باشه دیگه هیچی. ما 100 سال از دنیا عقب میافتیم.
He's saying, as it is right now, we're already 50 years behind the rest of the world. And if our infrastructure were to be destroyed and this government were to stay in place, we'd be 100 years behind the rest of the world.
Now many people in Iran's capital are desperately trying to flee. Iran said Israeli strikes have killed at least 224 people and wounded hundreds of others. But the officials haven't updated those numbers since Sunday. But human rights groups in the country also say those official figures are a significant undercount. Inside Israel, officials say at least 24 people have been killed and more than 600 injured by Iranian strikes. Meanwhile, the rest of the globe is anxiously watching. This is a fluid situation, and as we enter the 5th day of this conflict, there is no clear end in sight. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Tuesday, June 17th. Today, I speak with the Post's Yeganeh Torbati about how we got here and why these direct attacks between Israel and Iran are what so many have feared for decades. Hi, Yeganeh.
Hi, Elahe.
You and I were talking at 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning. What is the latest on what these attacks look like? Let's first start with Israel's attacks on Iran, which began last Friday. Where and what have they hit inside of Iran?
So starting very early Friday morning, Tehran time, Israel began striking military bases. It struck nuclear enrichment facilities. It killed top military generals and nuclear scientists. It used approximately 200 warplanes, striking over 100 targets in at least 15 locations across the country, using hundreds of bombs. And among some of those targets also were residential facilities where some of these scientists and military officials lived.
And what reasoning did Israeli officials give at that time as to why they were launching these attacks?
So their reasoning is that this is basically the last resort to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran's nuclear program has advanced in recent years, though it still hasn't actually produced an actual bomb as far as we know. And just before the attacks, the International Atomic Energy Agency had said that Iran was not complying with its nuclear nonproliferation obligations.
Mm-hmm. We heard earlier from one person inside of Iran, but I'm wondering if you could tell me more about how these strikes inside of Iran since Friday have impacted regular people throughout the country.
Right. So I should say that even the Friday strikes did have civilian casualties.
Mm-hmm.
There were other people living in those residential buildings that the nuclear scientists and generals lived in, and they were not themselves government officials or often even connected to the government. But then even since Friday, we're seeing a wider set of targets that Israel is carrying out. So it's hitting major urban areas right in the center of them, including in Tehran.
Which is like a huge city with like 10 million people living in it.
Huge city, millions of people. Yesterday, the Israeli government put out basically an evacuation order for a large portion of Tehran. People, some of my sources, people I knew had to leave that area and were like trying to find safe havens somewhere else in the city and then eventually trying to get out of the city. We're seeing huge lines on the highways, like just immense traffic jams that have lasted for 11, 12, 15 hours. People trying to get out, staying in their cars for hours and hours, their cars breaking down, their cars not having enough fuel, having to leave them at the side of the road. Just pretty much chaos as people try to get, especially to the north of the city, to kind of the smaller towns and villages in Iran's north.
Yeganeh, are these strikes, when we think of like the map of Iran, are they mostly hitting Tehran? Are they hitting targets all around the country? Are there people in other cities or towns worried that they could be hit?
Totally. There was a strike in Mashhad, which is in Iran's far northeast, which is very, very far inland into the country. And I believe one of the furthest in strikes that Israel has carried out. There have been strikes in and around Esfahan, sort of in central Iran, and then there's been strikes in western Iran as well. So it's not just Tehran where these have been concentrated, although many of them have occurred in and around Tehran. Israel struck the headquarters of state television, and we saw live on state television that happen and the news anchor react in real time. So it's going after now a set of targets that we don't know exactly what the military or even potentially nuclear component is. It's unclear. And in the meantime, it's really drastically affecting millions of people in terms of having to leave their homes, being hugely afraid of what might happen next, and then also getting injured and killed.
So now tell me about Iran's strikes on Israel. What is the latest on what Iranian missiles and other weapons have hit and the impact that has had on Israelis?
Right. So Iran has launched missiles and drones towards Israel in retaliation. It's hit Tel Aviv suburbs, the northern city of Haifa, where Israel has a major oil refinery. We're talking about hundreds of missiles and drones, really trying to kind of overwhelm Israel's missile defense system. So far as we know, the Iranian strikes have managed to kill 24 people and injured hundreds more. And Israel has accused Iran of trying to hit civilians in cities, but it's unclear whether they were targeting military infrastructure that may have been located next to, for instance, a residential building. Iran still has potentially hundreds of missiles that it can use to keep trying to strike Israel. It's firing many of them simultaneously to kind of overwhelm those defenses.
Mm-hmm. So what explains the disparate impact on Iranian and Israeli civilian populations? I know that in Israel, for instance, it's very common for there to be public bomb shelters available to people. Is that part of the explanation here?
I think that's part of it. I think that you do have a culture and like a system of sheltering in Israel because they've been the target of other missile attacks. In Iran, that has not been the case. Iran did have a war experience in the 1980s where sheltering was very common. But as far as I can tell, if there are bunkers remaining in big cities, they're not widely accessible or there's not that many of them. We had a senior Iranian Tehran city official say that we basically don't have adequate bunkers and bomb shelters in Tehran because it's had not been something that the government had focused on in the past. And also, I think a big element of this is that it appears that the Iranian government was completely taken by surprise with this attack. So just as the government was surprised, I think the civilian population has also been surprised and fairly defenseless.
I know that this is such a complex conflict between Israel and Iran, and I would like to talk a little bit about why this has become the outcome so many people feared. And to do that, it's helpful to know how we got here. So I know there's a long history here, but maybe just very briefly, can you describe how Israel and Iran have been positioned against each other over the decades?
So the Islamic Republic of Iran was founded in 1979. It's a very theocratic, authoritarian form of government. Israel and opposition to Israel is an enormous plank of the Islamic Republic's ideology. It's kind of woven through their ideology about themselves, what they believe that the Islamic Republic's purpose is. And Israel sees Iran under the Islamic Republic and its policies as effectively an existential threat.
And just how has that ethos manifested in terms of how Iran has spent its money?
Yeah, one way that this has shown up in Iran's policy is through funding proxy groups that oppose and fight Israel, including Hezbollah and Hamas.
How has this relationship between Israel and Iran changed in recent years?
Right. So in recent years, we've seen the two countries go from kind of this proxy/hidden war in the shadows. And I should say it's not just Iran targeting Israel through Hezbollah and Hamas. It's also Israel targeting what it sees as threats in Iran. So it has assassinated nuclear scientists. It has tried to sabotage Iran's nuclear program, but all kind of in the shadows, not in kind of this direct, open way. And that dynamic kind of started to shift really last year. So Israel assassinated a top Hamas leader when he was staying in Tehran. Israel killed Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and Israel targeted a diplomatic compound of the Iranians in Syria. And in return, Iran responded with a missile strike in Israel in 2024. And that was really, all those things taken together were sort of, at that point, the most open manifestation of this kind of long simmering conflict.
So these two countries have been intense enemies for a while now. Why did Israel launch these attacks now?
I think the answer to why Israel decided to do this now is that they thought this was sort of their last chance to stop Iran before it was able to build an actual nuclear bomb. But there's also sort of this broader context of these nuclear talks that Iran has been holding with the Trump administration over the past few months.
After the break, I talk with Yeganeh about how Israel's strikes put the United States in a complicated position. We'll be right back. So, Yeganeh, I want to now turn to the United States because they are also a major player in all of this. They've been a major player throughout the years, but in this moment, they're going to be crucial. The U.S., as many of us know, is Israel's biggest supporter and supplier of aid. The U.S. has also had a very tense, to put it lightly, relationship with the Islamic Republic over the years, technically no direct diplomatic relationship. But we've also seen in recent months that the Trump administration has been having these direct talks with Iran. Tell me about those talks.
Right. So Trump has sort of deployed his senior aides, Steve Witkoff, to hold several rounds of negotiations with the Iranian government over some sort of nuclear deal. And they were making progress at some points. At some points, they seemed to be completely far apart. But these talks were ongoing. And there was a sixth round of talks that was supposed to happen on Sunday, 2 days after Israel started its attack. So, that had been kind of a process that was happening, and there were hopes that there could be a diplomatic solution to this issue.
And just really briefly, tell me about Iran's nuclear program. Like, what do they say it's for, and how much have they put into this?
So the Iranians say that their program is peaceful. They've always said that. And they say that they have a right to enrichment of uranium for peaceful purposes. And they say they want to use this for medical purposes, for energy purposes. And, in some ways, it's a matter of pride for them as well, that, we're an independent sovereign nation. There's no reason that we should not have this when other countries do have this. Of course, many, especially the United States and Israel, believe that it is not a peaceful program.
And I mean, there was an agreement previously to try to constrain Iran's nuclear program, and President Trump withdrew from that during his first term.
Right. So President Obama, especially his second term, he really focused on getting a deal with Iran that would limit its nuclear program, put it under strict observation in return for the lifting of some of the harshest sanctions that Iran had been facing. And President Trump on the campaign trail, basically said that deal was a disaster. And in office, in his first term, he pulled out of that deal.
So now the Trump administration has been engaged in trying to strike a new deal to limit Iran's nuclear program. And just days before another round of talks was set to take place, Israel launches these strikes. Is that timing a coincidence?
I, don't know exactly what Israel was thinking, but I think it's hard to look at that and think that they're totally disconnected. Israel has never really been a fan of the idea of these talks. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was hugely against the deal that President Obama and his diplomats struck back in 2015. And I think they're very skeptical of them now, and the idea that this would actually limit Iran's nuclear program and lessen the threat to Israel that they see from the Islamic Republic.
Mm-hmm. So where does the United States stand now on Israel, its ally, striking Iran?
Well, the U.S. faces a really tough choice. So when the strikes first happened, the statements that we saw from U.S. officials were very much trying to kind of distance the United States from involvement in this. Of course, the Iranians did not see it that way, and they immediately said that, because the U.S. is a supporter of Israel, it's also implicated in this. One of the major objectives that Israel has is to basically completely incapacitate Iran's nuclear program. In order to do that, it would have to incapacitate this one facility called Fordo that is under hundreds of feet of concrete. It's deeply, deeply underground. It's inaccessible with regular bombs. The one kind of country that's capable of hitting a target like that and destroying it is the United States with what's called a so-called bunker buster bomb. And so if this sort of mission that Israel has launched, this sort of series of strikes, is going to achieve its objective, you would think that you would have to bring in the U.S. in order to do that. But that then directly involves the United States in launching an attack on Iran, and that kind of opens up a whole new vista of issues.
Well, yeah. Talk to me about why the United States and U.S. officials are reluctant to get directly involved and would want to give the appearance of distancing itself from its ally attacking what is also its enemy.
President Trump has campaigned and has kind of cast himself as someone who does not want to start new wars. And when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, when it comes to Israel-Gaza, at least his rhetoric has been, we want to make peace, we want to have a deal, we want to kind of avoid getting, especially the United States, involved more deeply into these intractable conflicts. And for then the U.S. to go and directly attack an Iranian site would completely go against that. So that's a big sort of issue that I'm sure the White House is discussing and trying to kind of wrap its head around right now. There's also a question of if the U.S. were to do that, then would Iran retaliate against U.S. bases in the region, soldiers stationed in the region, Americans overall? That is a really a big issue. And then does this conflict widen even further and just become a much more violent and complicated war?
What has Trump said about this conflict so far?
So although the White House did, and the administration kind of initially tried to sort of distance themselves, President Trump's statements in the days after sort of almost endorsed the attack in a way. He was basically saying that Iran should have made a deal when they had a chance. I gave them the chance to do it, and they refused. And so this is now what happens. And in one of his posts, he warned people to get out of Tehran, which seemed to kind of indicate that there would be wider attacks on the city. And he's basically said that they need to just make a deal in order to make this stop. And he's also said repeatedly, especially in recent hours even, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Now, we don't know what that means. Does that mean that he's going to decide that in order to accomplish that goal, the U.S. should get involved? Like, that's still very unclear.
We heard from someone, again, at the top of this conversation who was expressing a range of mixed emotions, in part because this is an Iranian man who's been living under this government that he finds very repressive. And this government in Iran has already withstood a lot of internal dissent and remains in power. And I'm thinking even the more recent woman life freedom and anti-government protests, the Iranian government cracked down very harshly, imprisoned and killed some of its own people. So I think this conflict with Israel, a lot of people are asking this question, as Mehrdad did, will this weaken the Iranian government to the point that it could fall?
Yeah, I think that Iranians have a deep pessimism right now about their own ability to change their government for the better, whether that is through reform or through toppling it themselves. They've tried various methods over the, past 10, 20, 30 years, and none have seemed to really work. And so there was some hope when this began that perhaps Israel could do it for them, despite, of course, the risks of a wider war, which are really unpredictable and which we just can't know ahead of time how things are going to end up. We don't know yet. It's really hard to tell. We don't know if there's dissent right now among the top military ranks against the clerical leadership for having gotten Iran to this point. We don't know if there's potential for, when the supreme leader dies.
Who is the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei?
Yeah, his name is Ali Khamenei. He's 86 years old. He's been ruling Iran since 1989. When he passes, what kind of system would come after, if it would remain clerical, how it would change. And we don't know, if these attacks are going to lead to some sort of drastic political change. I haven't seen indications of that yet, but we're still in the very first days of this, and we just don't know what's going to happen. And there's an open question and some chatter about, could Israel attack and kill the supreme leader himself? And then what would happen in that case? Who would actually be running the country? We just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Where could this conflict head from here? Could we be seeing this going toward a war?
Yes, I think that's very, very possible. This could go on for days more, weeks more, and it's unclear to me kind of what is the end state of this. What is the development that then kind of puts an end to this? Is it the destruction of all these nuclear facilities? Is it regime change? And things could just spiral in a quite dangerous way.
Yeganeh, thank you so much for joining and explaining all this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeganeh Torbati is a reporter for The Post. She's also the co-author of the upcoming book, Stolen Revolution: Betrayal and Hope in Modern Iran. It comes out next year. After Yeganeh and I spoke, President Donald Trump ratcheted up tensions with Iran. He claimed the United States knows the location of the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but that the U.S. is not looking to assassinate him, for the time being. Trump made the comments in a social media post. It was one of several posts he made in recent hours that took an increasingly hostile posture toward Iran. The Post is continuing to cover this as Trump weighs a larger U.S. role in this conflict. You can read more at WashingtonPost.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you appreciate our show and the coverage we're providing here, help other people discover us by leaving a rating on Spotify or a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Lucy Perkins. Thanks to Aaron Cunningham. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.